life is good, but so is autonomy. I wanted to see if how I was interpreting it was actually what the director intended, and turns out no, not really. It seems more like he just doesn't have anything else to do today. Because if you don't care about a character, neither will we. Hello, and welcome to this monthly movie roundup. I'm Ada, and these are the new releases I'll be reviewing for the month of May 2024. As always, the purpose of these videos is to provide recommendations, so I won't be getting too deep into plot details, and I will be using a 3-tiered rating system for each film to let you know if I think it's worth your time, yes, no, or the ever helpful maybe. Before we get into it, apologies for the April hiatus, life got busy, but I did see 4 movies to review, 2 which I really enjoyed, La Chimera and The First Omen, which is on Hulu now if you do want to see it. One which was just okay, and that would be Hundreds of Beavers, and then one which was probably the worst film I've seen since 2004's Walking Tall starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and that would be Civil War. Though I would note, I do not blame Kirsten Dunst for that failure by any means. I think she did the best she possibly could with what she was given, and I did appreciate the Silver Apples track in the intro. But overall, very bad. Also, apologies if my voice is a little weak in this video, I'm still getting over something. One of the many perks of teaching children out in the world rather than working from home, which is what I did before, is I get sick now. And I also get gifts of beautiful artwork. So, anyway, I have learned my lesson at this point that if a child is giving "I don't feel good" body language, you don't crouch down next to them and say, "Oh, what's wrong?" You should always maintain a safe distance from creatures who appear to be ill, which happens to be relevant advice for characters in our first film today, New Life. Let's get into it. New Life premiered on May 3rd. It's directed by John Rosman and stars Sonya Walger and Haley Aaron. The IMDb description is, a mysterious woman on the run and the resourceful fixer assigned to bring her in. Their 2 unique stories inextricably link as the stakes of the pursuit rise to apocalyptic proportions. So at the beginning of each month, I watch all the trailers for movies coming out, and this one looked pretty interesting to me, like it had a couple layers to it. And it does, but some of those are more successful than others. As stated in the description, this movie follows 2 different women, one who's on the run from the other, and they're both in different ways grappling with the fact that life is not going to be what they thought it was, both personally and possibly on a global level. Jessica, the woman who's running, is in a situation where it's hard to believe things will end well for her, but she's giving it her best shot because what else can she do? You do really feel for her and can maybe relate on some level given, among any number of other issues, impending climate doom, failure of governments to respond with appropriate urgency, etc. I think her story is the more successful of our 2 main characters. The way she deals with even the very small ethical dilemmas of being on the run feel very real. She clearly doesn't want to harm anyone, but she's got to eat, so what do? Who do you steal from? Do you take more than you need, etc.? I appreciate that they didn't turn her into some action hero. She doesn't steal a car or arm herself with a bunch of guns or anything over the top like that. She just wants to live her life. On the other hand, we have Elsa, the fixer, as she's referred to in the description, who's a bit less nuanced, almost a caricature. She's a gruff, workaholic, quasi-law enforcement agent who gives everything to the job and lets no one in. It's a pretty common type, especially on network TV crime shows, which is what a lot of her side of the story feels like. She herself is not terribly written. She does have a bit of an arc, and I think the actress did what she could with the role, but a lot of the vague intelligence agency plot is executed in a really cheesy manner. You've got the tech guy and the high tower type who can access video feed from every camera in the world and drinks out of a mug that literally says Big Brother. And then you've got the mysterious older man giving orders over the phone who is very dramatic. You don't see these characters in the same location ever, and it feels like they kind of had different ideas of what this movie was, especially like the man giving orders over the phone delivers his line in a very cheesy forensic TV show kind of way, and the editing around his scenes does follow suit with little montages of numbers and top secret documents flashing across the screen, so that kind of brings the movie down a bit. The other thing that really brings it down is the soundtrack. I don't think this was a very big budget project. It was a VOD release. I didn't see this one in theaters. A smaller budget is not a problem in and of itself, as long as you're realistic about your limitations. And when it comes to the music, it seems like they wanted a big dramatic score, but they didn't have the ability to hire a composer who they could work closely with and make something unique and custom fit to this film. So instead of accepting that and going in a more minimal direction, what they give us instead are tracks that sound like, I don't know how else to describe it, but royalty-free. They often feel far more dramatic and urgent than the situation necessarily calls for, so that's pretty distracting. It seems like the only song they did pay to use was Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, which is apparently the only song Elsa knows. She's listening to it in nearly every scene, which is a choice. But to hop back to Jessica, our woman on the run, I think there is something quite hopeful about her courage to pursue a life that will look vastly different than she had expected, but I feel like the overall message gets a little convoluted on Elsa's side, and sometimes slips between life-affirming and life-enforcing. I'm not saying this is the intended message of the film, but at some point the line, "suicide is vanity," comes up, and that in conjunction with Elsa's overall arc does seem to imply that the only noble choice is to pursue life at all costs, which I do take issue with, like, for example, in a case of terminal illness, which is actually relevant to our story here. I don't feel comfortable passing judgment on anyone for making the call that, given the suffering they're experiencing and their lack of ability to do things that bring them joy, their quality of life has degraded to a point at which it's no longer worth living. I think that's a personal assessment, and life is good, but so is autonomy. But that might not be an issue to you, it just rubbed me the wrong way. Overall, I think there were some good ideas and solid performances in this film, but its weaknesses overshadow its strengths, so this one is a no for me. Next up, Evil Does Not Exist. Evil Does Not Exist premiered on May 3rd. It's directed by Ryusuke Hamaguchi and stars Hitoshi Omika, Ryushi Kosaka, and Ayaka Shibutani. I probably butchered all of those names, I apologize. The IMDb description is, Takumi and his daughter Hana live in Mizubiki village, close to Tokyo. One day, the village inhabitants become aware of a plan to build a camping site near Takumi's house, offering residents a comfortable escape to nature. Unlike our last film, which had to pick and choose from pretty ill-fitting tracks, this one was actually created to accompany an existing work of music. I did not know that going into it. I learned that from watching an interview with the director afterwards, which is something I normally wouldn't do before reviewing a movie, but I had so many thoughts about this one that I wanted to see if how I was interpreting it was actually what the director intended, and turns out no, not really. But that's one of the great things about art that provides space for interpretation. Different people can come away with totally different takes based on what they bring to the experience themselves. One thing I was particularly interested in was how the title related to the film. It opens with a few minutes of this shot that's just an upward view of moving through a forest, so immediately I'm thinking, okay, we're centering nature here, so the title makes sense in that regard. When a frost kills plants or a hawk eats a rabbit, we don't assign any malicious intent to those actions, they're just part of the life cycle. Evil as a concept is more of a human invention. But as the movie progressed, and this is where we're definitely entering personal interpretation territory, I got the sense that the title wasn't limited to nature. Nature meaning the physical world outside of humans, which I know is a problematic definition since we are biological creatures. But anyway, I want to get into why I felt that way because I think it speaks to some of the strengths of this movie. So there are two kind of opposing forces in this film, a company that wants to develop a luxury camping site near this village, and the villagers themselves who would have to live with any possible negative impacts of that development. It's pretty clear from the outset that the company's plan is not well thought out, but the two main representatives of the company are not ever painted as villains. Their humanity is always apparent even when they might be trying to hide it, and they're fully fleshed out characters that feel very real in the ways they interact with one another and with the village community. When they're alone together, their dialogue stays pretty true to the rhythm and tone of actual coworker conversations. They speak with this levity and honesty that you can have in a low-stakes, purely contextual relationship where there's familiarity from all the time spent together, but no long-term investment. You get a sense from those conversations that they don't have much in common, but their interactions with the communities really highlight how different their approach to life is. When they're in a position of having to kind of make amends for initially coming into this village without doing their homework first, the female coworker, Mayuzumi, approaches this second visit with genuine curiosity about the people and the environment. While the first visit was humiliating, she's more interested in learning than in saving face. On the other hand, the male coworker, Takahashi, clearly feels a little too embarrassed and insecure to be open in that same way. He seems pretty preoccupied with ensuring that others see him as competent and respectable, which results in some of his words and actions coming off as performative and disingenuous, but not malicious. Our protagonist, Takumi, seems to be able to see these two people for who they are. He's not naive about the intentions of the company they work for, but unlike some others in the village that just shun these people, he's at least willing to teach them about the local environment, if for no other purpose than to demonstrate everything they've neglected to consider in their plan. While things do end a little dramatically with these characters, you don't get the sense that any one of them intended harm for harm's sake, so to me it feels like that understanding lens that we're able to have for conflicts in nature is extended to this human drama, possibly to humanity as a whole, which I think makes sense because I don't think you can fully exclude humans from a definition of nature. We are animals, so if nature is not evil, neither are we. I know I'm taking a much broader and more literal interpretation of the title than others would feel is accurate or than was even intended, but like I said, this movie allows space for interpretation, and that's one of its many strengths. I know it's a really hard sell, especially right now, to take the stance that pure evil is not a real thing that exists within humanity, but personally, I think evil would actually be a comforting thing to believe in if you could, because it would allow you to put a safe distance between yourself and people who do awful things. And to be able to think that person is evil or has evil inside of them, and thus we are categorically different, and I could never make the same choices as them in any possible timeline. I do think, given how socially advanced we are, there is something uniquely dangerous about human beings when our worst instincts as individuals are compounded through groupthink, mob mentality, nationalism, etc. But overall, life wants to live, we just have wildly different interpretations of what is required to facilitate that for ourselves and/or our genes, based on variations in our biology and environments, including our life experiences. Obviously, that doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility for actions that harm others, but it does complicate the question of how we deal with them in a way that ultimately minimizes harm to humanity in both the immediate and long term. So that's what I got out of this, though, like I said, I don't think that was necessarily the intention. As far as this movie goes, it's a yes for me. It's beautifully shot, the characters are carefully constructed, the performances are nuanced, the plot is compelling. I did think the score was distracting at times, but that makes more sense to me now, knowing that the music came first. But I would definitely see this one if you haven't yet. Next up, In a Violent Nature. In a Violent Nature premiered on May 31st. It's directed by Chris Nash and stars Ry Barrett and Andrea Pavlovich. The IMDb description is, when a locket is removed from a collapsed fire tower in the woods that entomb the rotting corpse of Johnny, a vengeful spirit spurred on by a horrific 60-year-old crime, his body is resurrected and becomes hell-bent on retrieving it. That's quite a sentence. Ironically, I think you could almost read the same message as evil does not exist into this movie, but that would be way more of a stretch, and I'm not going to attempt it. But this movie does also utilize an abundance of natural scenery. For most of it, you're following this big, heavy-footed guy slowly clomping through a forest, and it's very beautiful and serene. It takes place over 2 days, so you get to see the forest in all different lighting and hear how the sounds of birds and bugs and wind change throughout the day. So it's the sort of thing I might put on YouTube in the background while I'm working on other stuff. Except there's an egregiously violent murder every 5 minutes or so. And when I say egregious, I mean like junior high levels of creativity with the violence. I imagine a brainstorming process for the murder scenes that includes a bunch of 13 and 14-year-olds around a conference table like, what if he sticks a hook through a girl from the back and then hooks her head and pulls it all the way through her torso? That'd be sick. That does literally happen in the movie, which is fine. I don't have a problem with gore. I don't think it's inherently good or bad. It just depends on how you use it. But the problem here is I just don't care that it's happening because I don't care about the characters at all. The film follows the typical young hot people at a cabin in the woods get picked off one by one format, but in the few scenes that we get of the cabin group, all the characters are at best flat and at worst annoying. They're presumably in their early to mid-20s, but the dialogue is giving CW high school TV show, not in a charmingly cheesy way, just in an everyone is unnecessarily antagonistic way. The villain is pretty dull too. Supposedly his motivation is to get this locket back, but it seems more like he just doesn't have anything else to do today. So the only thing this movie really has going for it is the atmosphere, which is very nice. But because that's all there is, I found myself just getting annoyed that my calming little nature hike video was being periodically interrupted with gut sounds. The plot takes away more than it adds, so overall this seems like the kind of thing a band might project on the wall behind them during their set. It's not a main event on its own, it's just aesthetics. So it's a no for me. And now for our final film, Furiosa. Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, premiered on May 24th. It's directed by George Miller and stars Anya Taylor-Joy and Chris Hemsworth. The IMDb description is, the origin story of renegade warrior Furiosa before her encounter and team-up with Mad Max. Okay, this is going to be a long one. I did watch all the Mad Max movies in order to properly review this one. They are on HBO Max right now if you're looking for them. So, just a heads up, I may be giving spoilers for the others if you haven't seen them yet. And I will be going into a little more detail with Furiosa than I typically would in a review, so if you really want to see it and haven't yet, maybe come back to this after. Let's start with the good. concept. I do think it is to the detriment of the art of filmmaking and society in general that it's seemingly impossible to get an original idea made in Hollywood. If something's not part of existing IP or a biopic, it's usually not getting funded, and that sucks. So, while this movie is part of that problem, I do think that if you're gonna make another film in the Mad Max universe, a backstory for Furiosa does make sense as a starting point, because we basically go straight into action in Fury Road, which is the movie that introduces this character, and by the end of that film, we still don't know much about her history other than that she's from a nice place that no longer exists. Whereas Mad Max himself basically has an entire movie dedicated to his origin story, which would be the first film in the series. So there definitely was an opportunity there to add more depth to the story without having to introduce a whole new cast of characters. Whether or not they accomplished that we'll get into in a minute. I also enjoyed the performance from Tom Burke, who played the character Praetorian Jack, who's kind of our stand-in for Mad Max in this film. He does the reluctant hero thing pretty convincingly. He's guarded but also charismatic, similar to Gibson in the originals, and I think this role was the most successful casting in this movie. And lastly, I did appreciate the music, or lack thereof. Instead of embellishing all the action with a super dramatic score, the backing sound is mostly just from the rhythm of engines, which I think worked well for the parts they used that in Fury Road. And it still works here. It adds to the feeling of being isolated in a harsh, unnatural environment. And unfortunately, that is where the good ends for me, so you can probably tell by the timestamp this review will be mostly about the bad. My complaints pretty much fall into 3 categories. Number 1, pacing and plot. Number 2, environment and visual effects. And number 3, characters and casting. So let's start with pacing and plot. So this movie is about 2.5 hours long and divided by these little title screens into several different acts, I think 5 or something, but it doesn't really matter. Most of them feel way too long and repetitive, except for the last one, which feels awkwardly short and incomplete. For almost the entire plot of the sequel, Fury Road, and also a good chunk of this prequel, Furiosa is attempting to return to the land that she was taken from, which is referred to as this green place of abundance. Technically, this green place is where we start this movie, but we're only there for about a minute or two before Furiosa is taken, and then we spend the rest of the time running around the wasteland. Now, I think this is a huge missed opportunity, and I'll speak to this more in the next section, but all of the other locations we'll move through in this film were more or less already established in Fury Road, so the green place was the one chance for creativity with the world building, but all we get is a brief glimpse of it and then we're out. This isn't just a problem from the standpoint of visual interest, it's also a loss in terms of plot and character development. The green place is also referred to as the land of many mothers, and the contrast of the patriarchal top-down control of the warlords in the wasteland versus the more community-focused, cooperative, matriarchal society that Furiosa originates from and is seeking to return to is an important theme in Fury Road, which you would think would be relevant to her backstory, but it's basically ignored here. So we still never actually get to see that vision of a functioning cooperative society that was her main motivation in Fury Road. Her only motivation in this film is revenge, basically all the way through to the end, even though the action in this film ends exactly where Fury Road starts. The last act is so rushed and sloppy, there's no real attempt made to bridge who she is near the end of this film with who she is at the beginning of the next film. We just have to assume that she had some epiphany real quick that vengeance was an empty promise and what she really needs to thrive is freedom from oppression within a life-affirming community. What we actually get instead in the last act is a weird speech from the subject of Furiosa's vengeance, Dementis, which is melodramatic and a bit confusing. It's kind of in the vein of the classic "you and I are not so very different" kind of villain speech. He acknowledges that they've both been through trauma, and their actions are in part driven by the pain they've experienced, but are ultimately futile. But it doesn't really change her mind about seeking revenge or reveal anything new about him. It's just kind of pointless. It seems like they realized they were running out of time, so they just needed dramatic words to resolve Dementis' story and lead into a montage of images that moves us from this mess to the beginning of Fury Road. But the speech itself is pretty meaningless. I wouldn't be surprised if it was written by AI, and it certainly wouldn't lead me to any epiphanies about my purpose in life. So you might be wondering, if they didn't spend any time on world building or character development, where did that 2.5 hours go? And it's basically a lot of driving around the desert, fighting or destroying things, a lot of it either with Dementis, or chasing Dementis, or running from Dementis. There's a lot of Dementis gaining and losing power. It's kind of more about Dementis than Furiosa. We do get a little break from him when Furiosa is being mentored by Praetorian Jack and developing her war rig driving skills, but for the most part it's a lot of Dementis in the desert. Now I fully understand a Mad Max movie is going to heavily feature fighting things on the road, or more on sand dunes in this case, and that's fine, but you can do two things at once. In Fury Road they're basically always driving and fighting, and the action is great, but there's character development going on simultaneously. That's not so much the case here, but let's move on to our next category, environment and visual effects. Like I mentioned, I rewatched all the Mad Max films in order to review this, and I watched them in chronological order of the story. So before I saw Furiosa, I watched the first three, and then after, I watched Fury Road, because this one's a prequel. That was a bit of a mistake because this movie definitely assumes that the memory of Fury Road is still fresh in your mind, which it kind of wasn't for me because I had last seen it not too long after it came out back in 2015. But like I mentioned, outside of the minute or so spent in the Green Place, this film takes place within the world already established in Fury Road, of which the most striking and distinct environment would be the Citadel. Because that world is a new creation in Fury Road, they take time in that film to introduce you to the aesthetics of the environment and the characters. You still start with a familiar character, Max, but when he's kidnapped and brought to the Citadel, there are all these shots of things like the chest plate and mask being placed on the diseased-looking Immordon Joe, the war boys working machinery high up on the walls of the Citadel, and then the poor starving masses gathering below in hopes of receiving some water. So you're given a sense of how this place works and who lives here. That kind of care is not taken in introducing most of the settings or characters in Furiosa. It's just, now we're in the wasteland. Now we're in the Citadel. Now we're on the bullet farm. Of course they wouldn't want to repeat the exact same shots they had in Fury Road, but when we reach the Citadel in Furiosa, Furiosa is still a child, so it's a good 15 or so years before Fury Road, meaning there's an opportunity there to reintroduce this place and people as they would have been 15 years prior. Maybe Joe and the people leader look a little younger and healthier, maybe the conditions in the slums aren't quite as dire yet, but tension is building. But no, we don't get any of that. The world of the Citadel in this film is the same as 15 years later, and you already know what that looks like, so why bother with pretty shots of it? Like I mentioned, this movie does borrow all its aesthetics from Fury Road, so you have the hypersaturation with the bright orange sand and the bright blue sky, and of course, heavy reliance on CGI, which was already overutilized in Fury Road, but is used even in the most unnecessary of places in Furiosa. Like simple shots of a character getting into or out of a vehicle will be CGI. There's a shot of a lizard that's CGI. Lizards exist. Now, for safety reasons, I understand completely the need for CGI in some scenes. I would not want humans performing most of these stunts. But when characters are fluctuating between physical and computer-generated forms in scenes without much action at all, it gets a little weird. It's the most pronounced with Furiosa, and obviously you do have the complication of the mechanical arm to contend with, but even before she gets that, I rarely feel like I'm looking at human movement in any of her scenes, and that inevitably disrupts my investment in this character, which was already pretty low for reasons I'll get into in a minute. I was also surprised to see on the Wikipedia page that they bothered to film any of this in a real desert location, because all of the outdoor settings feel completely computer generated, or at least heavily altered. I'm sure some of that feeling of everything being fake can be contributed to the hypersaturation, and also the lighting feels like set lighting in some parts, but there's also no logic to the dust. Sometimes they remember to generate it around the vehicles, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the characters do look like they got a little dust on them, sometimes they come out of dust totally clean. Honestly, I don't really care about those little inconsistencies, but I think the reason why I started to notice them so much is because there simply are not enough shots of real landscapes or real human movement to balance all the ones that feel like a video game. I got the sense that I don't know what it would feel like to touch anything I see in this film. Which again brings me back to the importance of having all those introductory shots of a location, which can be on a smaller scale and utilize physical arts like makeup, costumes, set design, and practical effects for visual interest. I'm not asking for no CGI. I understand that would be a non-starter for a modern big-budget action movie. I'm just asking for balance. Again, lizards exist. Like I said, I watched the first 3 Mad Maxes before this one, so I did have a moment where I thought, oh, maybe I'm just being a curmudgeon who views older media through rose-colored glasses and reflexively rejects anything modern. Because I was really missing that campy feeling of the original movies, and I was wondering with this one, is my personal understanding of camp just so limited and inflexible that it can't include anything CGI? But then I rewatched Fury Road after, and I was like, oh no, CGI can be camp. They just didn't go for that in Furiosa. It's a lacking in personality. Usually each Mad Max film will introduce new characters and settings that are unlike anything we've seen before in the franchise. I already mentioned that this film does not take the golden opportunity for world building that the Green Place would have offered, so what does it actually add to the Mad Max universe? Dementis. Which brings us to characters and casting. I mentioned at the top of this review that a backstory for Furiosa could be a solid concept to build a film on. However, it seems like George Miller pretty quickly got bored of that idea, and of Furiosa herself, and decided to tack on a whole different movie about Dementis. So you have Furiosa's movie, which is basically a revenge story a la Kill Bill, Oldboy, John Wick, etc., and then Dementis' movie, which is kind of one of those sympathetic villain movies like Joker or Birds of Prey, where characters we've previously known as antagonists are centered and sometimes almost recast as anti-heroes. Except we didn't previously know Dementis, so that's a fly in the ointment. But anyway, Furiosa is boring in this movie. And I don't know how much of that should be attributed to casting and acting versus writing and directing. It's a mix. For casting, I don't think Anya Taylor-Joy was the right person for this role, but I also don't think she's a bad actress by any means. The first thing I ever saw her in was The Witch, and she's amazing in that. I think a lot of people in Hollywood must have felt that way too, and thought, we must put this girl in everything, because that's how things are done now. That oversaturation is not a new phenomenon, but it did seem to be more limited to genre or type in the past, like, oh, we've got a rom-com, we need Julia Roberts. Oh, we've got a weird guy, we need Christopher Walken. Now it's, oh, we have a male lead, we need Timothée Chalamet. All that to say, I don't blame any actor for not being right for every single type of role, that's a casting issue. But she does play this role a little bit more stiff and formal than I think would make sense. When she's at the Citadel, she's essentially trying to fly under the radar with all the other working grunts. She spends her adolescence in this rough life of dangerous physical labor, surrounded by others in the same position. But when we finally hear her talk, she sounds almost genteel. Very clear enunciation, precise wording, etc. It's a little incongruous. Even if she did have more early childhood education than her peers in the Citadel, that was over a decade ago at this point. And this could have been a directing decision, I don't know. I just feel like maybe we could have used someone else here. That being said, as far as writing goes, Furiosa is a straight, one-dimensional character in both this movie and Fury Road. In Fury Road, she's more of a foil for our reluctant hero Max, who we have a proxy for with Praetorian Jack in this film. She's not written to ever really falter or say anything funny or do anything unpredictable. She's a hero with a singular purpose. So as a writer or director, if you don't intend to add any more depth to that character, well, why give them a prequel? But I could see why you would want to spend so much time on someone else, like Max or the War Boy in Fury Road, or Dementis in Furiosa. So let's talk about Dementis. Dementis is the main addition this film makes to the Mad Max universe, and they went with a bold choice with this character to break from tradition and not give him a new unique aesthetic. He just looks like one of the rank-and-file leather biker boys with a teddy and a prosthetic nose. So we're really relying on the writing and the performance to make him memorable. As far as the performance goes, Hemsworth kind of plays him like a Jack Sparrow, self-serving, alternately incompetent and strategically genius, showboaty, a little drunk. He even does the dizzy gesticulating sometimes. I don't feel any type of way about it. It does seem a little unnatural for him sometimes, but his facial expressions are limited by a fake nose and looks like fake teeth too, so again, I blame casting. I feel like they were like, oh, we need the Australian actor. No, not that one. And then when it came time to film, it was like, oh no, we have a villain who's built like a Greek god and has a beautiful deep voice. Someone get a nose. Anyway, the teddy bear is meant to signify that he had a family once, which yeah, get in line, it's a post-apocalyptic wasteland, but that doesn't make him morally ambiguous in any way. He only does bad things, he just has varying levels of success with them. They also don't really explore that history because this is supposed to be a hero origin movie, not a villain origin movie. It just happened to get bored of the hero and decided to spend more time on the villain. But it's stuck in this bind because not only is this movie called Furiosa, Dementis is not a character in Fury Road, and we end this film exactly at the beginning of Fury Road. So the writers have to introduce this character, make us care about him, and resolve his storyline while also doing the Furiosa movie. This would not be an impossible task with 2.5 hours, but if you have to dedicate at least 2/3 of that time to blowing things up on the road, it does complicate things a little. So what we end up with is 2 half-baked storylines that ultimately feel inconsequential. I think it could have felt more complete if they unified the arcs a little. Initially, Dementis seeks power, Furiosa seeks vengeance. You could have had them both gradually realize that that's not what they truly want. They want the freedom of self-determination. But Dementis believes that the route to this freedom is by becoming one of the oppressors and wielding control, whereas Furiosa would realize that her path is to liberate the oppressed. This would have to work over time, not just as a sudden epiphany at the end. So, for Furiosa, since her final action is to attempt to free the wives and take them to the Green Place, you would need to spend a little more time developing that vision of how society functioned in the Green Place to understand the context she's coming from and contrast it with the treatment of the wives at the Citadel. In the movie, she really only sees the wives for under 24 hours before she pieces out, and most of that time she's not even with them, she's alone making a wig, so it makes no sense why she returns specifically to free them at the end. We needed a little more time with them to understand that. And then for Dementis, who's kind of on a Game of Thrones style quest to conquer territories and control resources, we do have fewer gaps to fill in with his story because this movie actually takes an interest in him. We see some of the tactical moves he makes to gain control of Gastown and the Bullet Farm, but it would be nice to see some of the social maneuvering he does once he's in there to try and sell everyone on his leadership so he's not immediately exposed to a coup attempt. I could see him possibly promoting this false grand vision of himself as a hero of the proletariat who understands and will fight for you, the little guy, but ultimately proves to be just as self-serving and power-hungry as the old bosses, but with less impulse control or interest in leadership and resource management. His troops would start turning on him, especially as more and more of them are dying in his name in a war of his and Joe's making, and then when Furiosa finally meets him on the battlefield, instead of choosing to exact revenge and kill him herself, she would have realized this would not bring her peace, and instead allow Dementis to be taken and murdered by an angry mob of his former subjects. It's a little cliché, but it's an idea that at least makes more sense for Furiosa. Another idea would be for Miller to just make the movie he clearly wanted to make about Dementis and not Furiosa. Because if you don't care about a character, neither will we. So, if you couldn't tell, this one's a no for me, but if you want an action movie with a similar vibe, I would just recommend watching Fury Road again. It's on HBO Max right now and it's a lot more entertaining than this movie. So that's it for this video. As always, thank you for watching, and if you have any suggestions for June movies, feel free to leave them in the comments below. See you next time.